Daniel chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Now, this is the same text we looked at last week, the same verses, but if you remember, if you were here, we didn't really get into the verses. I pretty much spent most of the time giving you historical background because you know how I am. And so tonight, I want to give you some more background because I think it's helpful, but we'll also be getting into some of the verses as well. But just as we begin, the historical situation, something you ought to know, and maybe you already do, is that when King Belshazzar held this banquet, Babylon, the city, was already under siege by the Medo-Persian Empire. That's the Medes and the Persians. They had joined together. And their army was encamped around the city of Babylon. But Belshazzar felt secure because he was convinced that no army could break through Babylon's walls. So how do we know that Babylon was already under siege? Well, it's because of what the Bible says. If you stay in the same chapter and you jump ahead to verse 30, which is the same story, it says, that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And we'll get into that story in a minute, how it happened. And Darius the Mede, the Medo-Persians, received the kingdom being about 62 years old. So it begins and it ends basically in one day, this chapter. And the question a lot of people have asked is, why was Belshazzar getting drunk at a party instead of preparing for battle? I mean, if you've got an army camped around your city, you think you'd want to be doing something about it. Well, the reason actually was Babylon had a fresh source of water that was flowing through the city. They had enough food stored in the city to last for several years. We know that because there was a Greek historian named Xenophon who wrote about this battle and told the details. And they had stockpiles and stockpiles of food. Plus there were gardens in the city. People could grow food. There were animals. It was a very, very large city. And so you've got water, you've got food and supplies, and then also you had Babylon's huge gates and walls, which were legendary in the ancient world. They were massive, very tall, very thick, and it was almost impossible for any army to have actually broken through those structures. Now, let's talk about the fresh water, because this has always been very interesting to me. You've heard of the Euphrates River, right? It, along with the Nile and the Tigris and some of those rivers in the ancient world, the Euphrates was one of the major rivers. It still exists in that part of the world. And the city of Babylon was built not far from it. And what they had done, the Babylonians were rather ingenious people in this way. They built a large canal from the city of Babylon into the earth and then connected it to the Euphrates. And so what it would do, it would divert water from the Euphrates and carry it directly from the river into the city of Babylon. And it was a large canal, like I said, enough to carry plenty of water for all of Babylon's needs and more. And so it provided water not just for drinking and cooking, washing, and all that. There was actually there was an elaborate irrigation system that allowed gardens where people could grow food. And you've heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the ancient wonders of the world. That was fed by this canal that came out of the Euphrates. Now, so people have said, well, why wouldn't an invading army simply, get on some boats and get on that canal, which is like a medium-sized river itself, and just come into the city if they were going to invade? Well, this is what the Babylonians had done. When they built their walls and strengthened them, they actually built them over the top of that canal where the water came in to the side of the city, and they brought the wall down far enough to allow water to pass through, but a boat couldn't. I mean, it was like perfectly engineered. And so, you know, even a mid-sized boat with enough for, let's say, 20 or 30 soldiers couldn't come through. And the canal was so big, and the Euphrates River was a very large body of water, only a very strong swimmer would have been able to get into it and swim through under there. And anybody weighed down by weapons or armor, like a soldier, would very likely have drowned. And beyond that, people in the ancient world, very few of them were swimmers. Most people were afraid of the water, didn't want any to be actually out there swimming. And so other nations had thought about attacking the city of Babylon because it was a very rich city, wealthy place, and a great prize, but no one could see a way to get in. Babylon was secure. Walls, water, food, supplies, well-armed. And so when you have all that in your head, right, now you kind of see why Belshazzar wasn't worried, right? Again, all these three things. He's got a safe water supply, and not just a pool that can get stagnant, but fresh water that's streaming through. He's got enough food and supplies stored up, not just for himself and the people in his palace, but for the whole city to make it for several years. And again, they've got gardens and livestock in the city itself, so that can also reproduce. And again, the walls and the gates were so high and so thick that they were pretty much seen as impregnable. You'd have to have an incredible war machine to be able to punch through those walls, a level of technology that didn't exist back then. So that's why he's getting drunk with his nobles. But what he didn't know, and some of you who've studied history, this is a kind of interesting story. The Medo-Persians weren't just an army of soldiers. They had engineers with them, and they set these men to work on this problem. And what these men did, they dug a trench next to the canal that fed Babylon's fresh water supply out of the Euphrates, and they opened it up at the right moment, and it diverted the flow of water out of the canal and took it off to a swampland. So they built their own river, basically. And so what happened, the water gets diverted, and the canal leading into Babylon gets dry enough that the army of the Medo-Persians could simply walk in under that gate, or under that wall, while everybody was sleeping, and a lot of them were drunk. We just read about the party, right? And so Daniel, when you read his version of the story, doesn't give us all the details because everybody knew, right? Back then he didn't have to repeat it. But we don't know all of this until we do our research, and now you know what happened. So let's reread verses 30 and 31, because now you have a bigger picture. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received his kingdom, being about 62 years old. History makes everything come together. Belshazzar's problem was he didn't realize something. He thought Babylon was powerful because his gods had made it powerful, his wisdom, his grandfather's wisdom. What he never realized is that there was really only one reason Babylon had become so powerful, and that was because years earlier, God had decided to use the Babylonians as his instrument of judgment against the people of Israel because of their rebellion. And so now Israel had been defeated, the people of Judah really, had been defeated, and so many of them had been brought to Babylon, and God's purpose now for Babylon was done. They had been the instrument of his judgment, and at that point, if God says, well, my use for you is over, it doesn't matter how strong your walls and gates are. It doesn't matter how much you have built up with food and water and supplies. Nothing could protect them because God had said, it's over, I'm done, I have no more use for you. And in fact, long before the Medo-Persian army actually entered the city, if you go to the prophet Isaiah in chapter 47, and this was written years before this took place, Isaiah prophesied what was coming. Verses 10 and 11, Isaiah says, and you felt secure in your wickedness. You said, no one sees me, right? I'm safe and secure in my fortress here, so to speak. Your wisdom and your knowledge led you astray. You said in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. But evil shall come upon you, which you will not know how to charm away. That's an influence of, they're talking about magic charms, right? You won't be able to use your magicians to ward this off. Disaster shall fall upon you for which you will not be able to atone, and ruin shall come upon you suddenly, of which you know nothing. Which is a perfect description of Belshazzar. He's getting drunk. He's sleeping it off, right? He has no idea that he's about to die. And I didn't read the entire chapter of Isaiah 47, but if you go back and read the whole chapter, you see at the very beginning of the verse, Isaiah is talking specifically about Babylon, so the context fits. Now, Belshazzar doesn't know any of this. If he'd asked Daniel would have known. Daniel would have known about what Isaiah's prophecy said. But Belshazzar wasn't someone who asked for advice from anyone, especially a Jewish person, because essentially he has no time for the Jews. He's all about himself, and no one's going to tell him what to do. He's one of those guys. So he ought to have been preparing for the enemies, right, outside his city, but instead he's hosting a party. And he wasn't just doing this out of ignorance. People say, well, poor guy didn't know. He knew about the miracles that God had performed during the reign of his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. But not only does Belshazzar refuse to humble himself before God, he actually insulted the God of Israel, right? That's why he brought in the vessels from the temple. And Daniel says this to him when he's called. We'll get into this in the next few weeks. Daniel's talking to him and he says, verse 22 of chapter 5, you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. And again, we'll get into it in more detail in the weeks to come. But Daniel's saying, you knew that what happened to your grandfather. You knew how God humbled him, but you refused to humble yourself. Instead, what does he say? Verse 23, you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you. You and your lords, your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which you do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. If you understand ancient cultures, then you know what Belshazzar was doing when he had these vessels brought in that had been captured from the temple in Jerusalem. This was actually a public statement that he was making that Babylon's gods were stronger than the God of Israel. Because he's saying, here, we're in Babylon. I've got these vessels of gold and silver from the temple of the Jewish God. And what he's doing here, he's trying to insult the God of Israel because he's a proud person. He knew what had happened to his grandfather, but he's saying, I'm different. That's not going to happen to me. And so what he's doing, not only is he's insulting the God of Israel, and he's also in the same breath or the same action trying to make sure the Jews living in Babylon remember their place. He's saying to them, you're the ones who are defeated. We're the ones who are in control. You're second-class citizens serving us. We're the ones in charge. And so we're going to use the sacred vessels of your God to drink a toast to our gods, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's kind of a funny way of saying it, but he's essentially trying to rub the faces of the Jews in the memory of their defeat. And that's because he thought he was safe. He had the circumstances that seemed to be absolutely fine. Why not have a party? Why not get drunk with my friends? He's thinking, I'm safe, no one can do anything to me. That's what pride does to people. You don't have to be the king of Babylon, right? To have this issue. When arrogance comes in, it causes us to behave in ways that don't take account of anybody else and what they think, right? Because it's all about me. It causes us to cast off restraint and behave in ways that are evil and hurtful to others. Because again, my pride makes it all about me. And the reason we do this is that when we get into sin and that pride comes up, God eventually gives us over, when we reach a certain point, to what the Bible calls a debased mind. And I can certainly say that Belshazzar was at that point. Paul talked about it in Romans 1. Let me read you verses 28 and 32, talking about how far sin will take you. this is talking about the Gentiles and their history of sin. It says, since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. And then verse 32, though they know God's righteous decree, like Belshazzar knew, right, that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. That's what Belshazzar's doing. He's mocking Israel's God. He's rubbing the face of the Jewish people in the memory of their defeat. He's pointing to himself as the one who's done all of this, and he's praising the false gods of Babylon. But in the same night, he's going to have to learn a lesson that everybody eventually learns. And you can quote this from memory, I'm sure, Galatians 6:7. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. That's a law. That's an unchangeable law. That no one gets past that. It may happen at a different point in your life than in somebody else's, but we all come to face with that at some point. Up to the moment of his death, Belshazzar genuinely believed everything was fine. He's relaxed. He's having a good time. But when you put your plans above God, everything is not fine. You may not know it, but the truth is, the only reason you don't know it is because you become blind to the reality of the situation. And eventually, your pride will catch up with you. Again, a very famous verse, you can all quote this, Proverbs 16:18. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. And so that's the lesson that Nebuchadnezzar had learned, right? Belshazzar's grandfather. And he had humbled himself, and God had restored him. But it's the lesson that Belshazzar refused to learn. He refused to humble himself, and at the end, it cost him everything.